were no Islamic extremist groups in Iraq because Saddam Hussein had repressed them all quite brutally. But after the US invaded and the full impact of the occupation became known to the people of Iraq, all kinds of rebel groups arose. Among the Shias, Shia Muslims, among non-religious people, among former Ba'athist Party, and one sector was these Islamic extremist groups. And the one specifically was it was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia was another name. And it was the predecessor to today's, it keeps cutting in and out. It was the predecessor to today's Islamic State. And if you recall, in 2007, 2008, there was the Anbar campaign, or we knew it as the Surge, where the US was fighting and sent in tens of thousands of extra troops to fight in Anbar province. Well, that was to fight the predecessor group to the Islamic State. And they were defeated militarily because the Sunnis of that area were so angry, were so furious at the rule that was being carried out by these extremists that they joined with the United States against the Islamic State, or the Al-Qaeda in Iraq at that time. They were defeated militarily, but not politically. And they laid low, and in 2011, when the uprising began in Syria, they migrated over there and started doing their organizing there, and under the guise of opposing Assad, but really with an effort to set up their own new dictatorship. So, to understand more about the US actions recently there, I went to the city of Erbil. Erbil is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. It's where the Kurdish regional government is located. And I spoke with leaders of the KRG, with Peshmerga leaders who are the military arm of the KRG, and with US diplomats. And I learned the official reasons for the US intervention, and they were threefold. One was to protect the Yazidis and other minorities. Two was to protect US military personnel based in Erbil. And three was to keep the Islamic State from overrunning the Kurdish region and seizing even more territory. But the more I interviewed people and the more I analyzed it, the less sense any of those reasons really made any sense. Because the Yazidi crisis basically ended very early in August. The people who had left, the people who decided to stay had stayed. There was the huge influx of displaced people stopped. And what did the US do? It intensified the bombing. Secondly, the US military personnel, the airports were open. They could have been evacuated in 24 hours or less, so that was a phony argument from the beginning. And thirdly, there was no possibility that the Islamic State was going to overrun the Kurdish region for the same reasons that I talked about before, which was the Kurds overwhelmingly opposed the Islamic State. They would never submit to their rule, and the Islamic State knew that. So their intention was not to come in and seize the 3 million people of the Kurdish region. They might have shelled or sent artillery fire or mortar fire into Erbil or other Kurdish cities. That would have certainly destabilized the region and caused a lot of grief to the Kurds, but there was no danger that they were going to be overrun. So if the official reasons for the war don't make any sense, what were the real reasons? And for that we have to go to the city of Kirkuk. Kirkuk is a city in northern Iraq that is a mixed city of Kurds, Turkmen, Christians, Sunnis, Shias. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious city that had been under the control of the Baghdad government, at least nominally. After July, the Kurdish Peshmerga took it over and continues to hold it today, because the Kurds consider it to be the historic capital of the Kurdish region, and the other people who live there don't. So it's a future flashpoint for sure because of those political disagreements. But the reason I went there was to find out more about the oil industry, and I hired a fixer to take me out to the oil fields. A fixer is journalistic lingo for somebody who arranges interviews and sometimes translates. And what I had studied and what he explained is that the Kirkuk was the site of the first oil discoveries in the Arab world in 1927. After the First World War, the British discovered oil there. They invited Americans and French to come in and form an oil company that then proceeded to pump and distribute the oil. And the fact that the three companies that did it were the victors in World War I, of course, was pure coincidence. And we had, of course, the spoils of war. And the subsequent governments in Iraq were dominated by first British and later American interests. The oil companies always had a free reign. And the people of Kirkuk suffered, actually, as a result. So as we're having this discussion, the fixer, as we're driving out for maybe 20 minutes outside of downtown Kirkuk, there's this huge flame that appears in the distance. It's like the largest open flame I've ever seen. And it's a landmark for Kirkuk. What is it? It's oil flare. It's a natural gas flare off the oil wells, which you're supposed to cap, both because it's economical to use it for energy, but also because it's very environmentally damaging to be burning off this gas into the atmosphere. But apparently the oil companies had never gotten around to capping it because it had been burning since 1933. So as he's explaining this background to me, he starts singing, my fixer. He just breaks out in songs. I don't know if you know any young Kurdish men, but they love to sing. And I asked him what the song was, and he says it's a lament for the people of Kirkuk. It's a lament of the oil, the curse of oil. In other words, supposedly the oil brings riches to a country, but it doesn't benefit the people of Kirkuk. It just brought them foreign interference and war after war, including the 2003 occupation of Iraq by the United States. And the song, which is in Kurdish, was so famous that my other fixer that I brought with me from Erbil joined in. That's how they were singing together. And that really illustrates one of the main reasons that the U.S. is involved, despite all the protestations about being favoring human rights and we don't go to war for oil and blah, blah, blah. In reality, it's about oil. Iraq has the third largest oil reserves in the world. The Kurdish region has the 9th largest oil reserves in the world by itself, according to Kurdish officials. And of course, in the region, you have Saudi Arabia, which has the largest, and Iran, which has the 2nd largest. Those figures are sometimes in dispute because Venezuela claims they're in there somewhere too. But anyway, we're talking about a big chunk of the oil industry. And sometimes I'm asked, well, look, the United States is developing a lot of oil. We have shale oil here where our production is way up. We don't need that Middle East anymore, so why would we intervene over there? Because it's not about supplying oil for the American people. It's about controlling the oil markets and denying that control to your enemy. So one is your companies, BP, Shell, Chevron, Mobil, et cetera, all of those companies, you want them to be exploiting the oil, and you want oil companies from China, Russia, and Iran not exploiting the oil. That's the name of the game. And in order to do that, you need pipelines that take the oil out, which means you have to protect the sea lanes, and you need armies, and you need military bases to maintain stability. And of course, that was one of the purposes of this current campaign. The U.S., by the way, I'll just make a slight footnote here. Did anybody else notice that we lost the war in Iraq? Because, of course, the United States doesn't lose wars. And since we don't lose wars, we couldn't possibly have lost the war in Iraq either, except reality kind of intrudes. In 2008, the United States, under George Bush, Mr. Defend Our National Interests, Fight the War on Terrorism, George Bush, signed an agreement with the Iraqi government to remove all U.S. troops and all U.S. military bases by the end of 2011. And it was not Obama who initiated this, it was the Bush administration. And the problem that Obama faced is that come the end of 2011, the Iraqis insisted that the United States actually live up to one of its agreements. An unknown policy in Washington, apparently, because the Iraqis insisted on it, and the U.S. had to pull out. So the US troops pulled out, the bases were closed, and the resulting government in Baghdad was more friendly to Iran than to the United States. That's a pretty good definition of defeat. And the US, while not acknowledging that, wants to reverse it. So we want to reestablish our military bases, and we want to have a pro-US government in Baghdad, and if possible in Damascus, and if even more possible in Tehran. That's the name of the game. So the real reasons for this current war is economics, geopolitics, military bases. Now, the US has formed a coalition to support this latest war effort, because we always form coalitions, right? The Vietnam War was a coalition. You remember that? South Korea and the Philippines and Australia were all allies in our heroic fight in Vietnam, except it was really a US war, and history recognizes as that. And now supposedly we have 40 allies involved in this war. They can't name exactly who they all are, but we're told there are 40. And the reality is, yes, there's some other countries doing some bombing raids, but the US is carrying the vast majority of the weight politically and militarily. And the other so-called allies are range from enthusiastic to reluctant, but absolutely none of them are willing to send in combat troops. And the US faces a rather big problem, which is that everybody acknowledges, including the Pentagon, that we can't win the war through air power alone. You have to have somebody who's going to go in, fight for, say, the city of Mosul, and then run the city after you've defeated the enemy. And there's nobody in Arab Iraq, and there's nobody in Syria at all who can do that. So the pressure will mount for the US to send in troops, to increase the number of troops. And so far, we had 1,500 advisors. They're not combat troops, advisors. And then just about a week ago, the Obama administration announced there will be another 1,500 troops going. But this time they could go out in the field and into combat. But they're not combat troops. They're assisting and training the Iraqi army, and they're flying the helicopter pilot. You know, give me a break. If Putin were doing this in Ukraine, and he claimed he had 3,000 advisors in Ukraine, would we say, oh yeah, sure, they're not combat troops? No, nobody would believe that. And frankly, nobody in the world believes that we don't have combat troops there now. So to better understand this coalition and the interests of the various other parts of the region, I want to take you to Sulaymaniyah. Sulaymaniyah is the second largest city in Iraqi Kurdistan. And it was a trip, a previous trip that I went on. And I stayed in an old Saddam Hussein era hotel. And they were pretty dismal places. There were concrete blocks covered over with cement, painted gray. And the beds were made of concrete. It was the kind of place that was like a one-star hotel, but the star had fallen off. So the one saving grace to the hotel was downstairs there was a tea house. And every morning, people would gather to drink tea who were diplomats and journalists and spies. And they would all trade gossip and information, and it was a great place for me to find sources. In fact, they looked like something out of an old Graham Greene novel, you know, with the only thing missing were the fezzes, you know, and Peter Lorre. So, but first, in order to get my sources, I had to learn how to drink the tea, you know, to kind of pass as a regular on there. Now, tea in that part of the world is made in a very particular way. You take 3 or 4 teaspoons full of sugar. You put it in the bottom of a glass that's about this tall. It's got a slight indentation in it, and there's no cup holder, and there's no cup handle. It's just the glass. And then you take the sugar and you put in strong black tea leaves and boiling hot water. And then you stir it up with a spoon. So you have really strong, really hot, really sweet tea. And how do you drink it? And I see some of you going, I know, all right. Because you've been there, that's why. If you hold it by the lip, the steam comes up and burns the palm of your hand, so you can't hold it that way. If you hold it sideways, try to grasp just as little of the lip as you can. It's just too hot. So I was stymied, but you know, I'm an ever inventive, experienced investigative reporter, and I decided to look around the room and see how everybody else was doing. So the most favorite method seemed to be to take some of the hot tea, you pour it in a saucer, see, And then you look to your left and see who's spying on you. And then you look to your right and see who's spying on you from over here. And you slurp your tea and make eye contact, see? And that's the way I was able to set up some of my interviews. And these were like Brits and Canadians and Iraqis and Kurds and Turks. And what I learned from interviews there, but also in other parts when I did subsequent interviews in the region, is that everybody has a plan for what the United States should do. Everybody has their own long-term plans, neither of which mesh, and none of which are a benefit to the people of the United States. So let me explain. The current Kurdish leadership, the KDP, is the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is the ruling party in Iraqi Kurdistan, is the Kurds are held up as the staunchest of allies of the United States because they have a reliable military force. The U.S. is now arming and training them, sending in arms and ammunition, more sophisticated weapons, in order to fight the Islamic State. But the Kurds, at least the KDP's goal, is independence from Iraq. They announced plans for a referendum on independence, and when I interviewed them, they postponed it, but by no means have they canceled it. So the danger is that while for now the United States is arming them to fight the Islamic State, tomorrow or next week or in some months down the road, they'll be using those arms to fight the Iraqi army when the independence struggle breaks out. So the U.S. and the Kurdish interests are aligned for the moment, but may or may not be for the medium term. In the case of Turkey, Turkey is supposed to be part of the coalition, but the Turks have been very reluctant partners, to say the least. They won't allow the U.S. to use the insular air base to fly missions over Syria or Iraq, which is actually a logistical problem for the U.S. That means they have to fly longer flights from other places. The Turks have a very different policy towards the Kurds than the United States does at the moment. There's been a 30-plus year war between the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and the Turkish government. And the Turkish government considers the PKK to be just as much a terrorist organization as the Islamic State. Well, there's a slight problem, which is that you've all heard of the city of Kobani. It's the city that's mostly Kurdish in Syria, near the Turkish border. Well, the people fighting the Islamic State there are overwhelmingly from an affiliate of the PKK. The United States considers the PKK to be a terrorist organization, as do the Turks. So the question becomes right now, the United States is dropping arms and ammunition to the affiliate of the PKK. So we're arming a group that we consider to be a terrorist organization. Why? Because we're so desperate to find allies on the ground in Syria that will ally with anybody, even if it's a huge contradiction in the U.S. stated goals. By the way, I don't actually consider the PKK to be a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda or something. They engage in armed struggle, but there's a big difference. And by the way, I have a chapter in my book. Did I mention the title was Inside Syria? There's a chapter in my book about the Kurds and Syria. And the second big difference that the Turks have is that they see Saddam Hussein, Bashar al Assad, the president of Syria, as the main enemy, not the Islamic State. And that's actually a view shared by a lot of the rebel groups as well. And you may remember that it was only a little over a year ago that the United States was preparing to bomb Syria, bomb the Assad government over their chemical weapons issue. Remember that? It was wonking up support and popular opinion basically prevented that from happening. Well, now we're bombing one of the main groups opposed to Assad. And a lot of people in Syria can't figure it out because in Syria, it's a zero-sum game. If you're helping one side, you're hurting the other. Or hurting one side, you're helping the other. So in this case, the U.S. is bombing one of the strongest anti-Assad groups, the Islamic State, and which allows Assad to continue bombing other rebel groups. So the U.S. is caught in the middle of an impossible political situation and an impossible military situation, all of which is perfectly predictable. This is not something You know, you wait and see, a year from now or 3 years from now, they're gonna say, oh gosh, how could we have foreseen that things would have gone so badly in this new war? I'll tell you how, by listening to ordinary people, by doing some investigation on the ground in Iraq and Syria, and not doing things through the prism of Washington politics. Now, the other country that is heavily involved on the US side is Saudi Arabia. And their current plan, the US recognizes that it has nobody on the ground in Syria that it can ally with to fight. So the idea is to create 5,000 moderate rebels and take them to Saudi Arabia for training. Train them for a year and then bring them back into Syria. Well, on its face, it's an absurd policy because at a minimum, if you started it right now, it would take you a year. So what are you supposed to do with that year? But it gets worse, folks. It gets worse. First of all, when you hear the term moderate, it makes no sense at all unless you understand what it really means as pro-US. See, what we're trying to do is arm and find and arm pro-US rebels and then redefine them as moderate regardless of what their politics are. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, ideologically, politically, and in terms of their religious beliefs, they've been supporting the extremist groups in Syria for a long time. I did an article for the Global Post exposing how the Saudi government and the Saudi wealthy individuals were funding al-Nusra, which was the affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And it was also the group from which the Islamic State emerged. So the Saudis, for their own reasons, don't trust the pro-US groups, the so-called moderates, and very much favor the extremists. So the idea that we're going to send people there to get training in being moderates is like sending Chicago police cadets to be trained by Al Capone. I mean, it just ain't going to work. In order to understand the further complications of US policy, I have to take you to another city full of diplomats and spies, and that's the Washington, D.C. So I got lost on my way to the State Department. Now, any of you who've been to Washington know that that's not easy because the State Department takes up an entire block. It's got its own metro stop called Foggy Bottom. You can't get lost going to the State Department. Everybody knows where it is. People on the street actually speak English, and I was able to get to them. So it turns out what had happened was I had been asked by a low-level State Department analyst on Syrian affairs to come speak to a group of other analysts of the State Department. And I said, look, forget it. It's not going to work. My views are too far outside the box. It's not going to, oh no, it's really important that they hear what you have to say. Okay, fine. So I said, I'll do it if I can get an interview with a State Department spokesperson for my book. They said, okay, so we made a deal. But it turns out her office was not in the main part of the State Department. It was an annex across the street down the block. So when we finally straightened that out, then I wasn't lost anymore. And I went and I spoke to these State Department folks. And sometimes I hear that, well, one of the reasons that the US policy in the Middle East is so messed up is because we don't understand the language and the culture and the traditions of the Middle East, and that's the source of the problem. Well, actually, that's not been my experience. These folks in the State Department and other diplomats I've met are the most knowledgeable about Syria of any Americans I've ever met. I could mention obscure rebel groups. They knew exactly who I was talking about. Some of them had lived in Syria prior to the 2011 uprising. Some of them spoke Arabic. So these were very knowledgeable specialists. So the problem is not lack of knowledge, it's bad policy. And the reason I think that the policy goes so bad consistently, and this is true whether it's the CIA or the Pentagon or the State Department, any government agency dealing with this stuff, is because as the policy recommendations work their way up the chain of command, up to the undersecretary, the secretary, and ultimately to the White House, the reality on the ground in Syria gets lost and in favor of the reality on the ground in Washington. In other words, everything is perceived through the very, very narrow prism of Washington politics, what high-level Democrats and high-level Republicans want, not what the people of Syria or Iraq want or need. Example, The current policy on the Middle East, and specifically Syria, is you have one of two camps. The traditional interventionists, the people who intervene for national interests, whether it be oil or military bases or whatever. People like John McCain, currently. Now, John McCain has never met a country he didn't want to invade. And certainly that was the case in Syria. Or Lindsey Graham is another one. Or Hillary Clinton, who is also an interventionist on this stuff. And then you have on the other side the humanitarian interventionists. They don't intervene for national interests, so-called. They intervene because to stop humanitarian atrocities. And they constantly refer to Rwanda and so on. And the Yazidis was the latest version of it. The Benghazi attack in Libya, remember that one? That was crisis number 118. We had to do something until we managed to destroy the country and turn it into a failed state. So if you're a civilian in Syria and you're getting bombed by the United States, it really doesn't matter whether it was done for traditional classical interventionist reasons or humanitarian intervention, you're still just as dead. So I came and I talked to the State Department folks and I delivered a message of non-intervention, which is what's wrong with not doing anything. No direct military bombing, no aiding on arming rebels, diplomatic efforts to pressure our allies and ultimately Iran and Russia and Hezbollah to stop their interference and allow the people of Syria and Iraq to ultimately resolve their own differences. Well, they looked at me like I had just landed from Mars, because obviously I don't understand the realities of world politics. The United States is the world's sole superpower, and if we don't do something, it creates a vacuum, and somebody else will. So we, being the good guys, should always be ready to intervene. Well, it's Venus and Mars or whatever, it's completely different views about how to look at the world. And sometimes I'm asked, well, Reese, if you were the president, or if President Obama called you and asked for advice, what would you do different, tell him to do differently? Well, first of all, for some reason, he's not returning my phone calls. But if, on the strange possibility that I ever get that phone call at 3 in the morning and I'm invited back to Washington, this is what I would say, is look, what the US is doing currently appears to be fighting the Islamic State. And in the short run, maybe it'll have some impact. But we will be seen as reoccupying Iraq, maybe occupying Syria. And we're going to end up helping the Islamic State, not defeating it, because every war is not just military, it's political. And right now, the Islamic State has adapted its tactics. They don't have airfields and large military bases that can be easily bombed. They simply evacuated the buildings they had been using as administrative headquarters and went into the civilian areas. So how are you going to fight them? So they've already adapted their tactics. And the more the US has to escalate, the more they're going to be able to claim to be the upholders of the fight against US imperialism and the fight against Israeli Zionism and blah, 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 blah. And we've escalated them. We've enhanced their reputation from a local evil group to an international cause célèbre among some sectors of people. Ultimately, we're going to help them politically in recruitment, and the only way to defeat these folks is politically and allow the people of the region themselves to fight it. So stop the bombing, stop the arming of groups, work politically and diplomatically to change our allies' policies of intervention. And based on that, I think we could go to the Russians and the Iranians, who, by the way, are not all that in love with Assad. Again, in my book, I have chapters on both Russia and Iran's relations with Assad and to Syria. They would, under certain circumstances, I think, cut Assad loose and be willing to form or help encourage the formation of a coalition government that wouldn't be hostile to their interests. That's what they're concerned about long term. The U.S. should help genuine multinational, multi-international efforts of relief. There are, some 6 million Syrians displaced, both internally and in neighboring countries of Lebanon and Jordan, Turkey, and other countries. now even Iraq, and they need help and assistance, and the U.S. is doing far too little in that regard. And the final piece of advice would be probably the most controversial, which is the U.S. wants us to believe, the U.S. leadership wants us to believe that all of these crises in the Middle East are separate and have nothing to do with each other. So you have over here the new war against Islamic State, and over here you have the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and that has absolutely nothing to do with it. And then over here you have the talks with the Iranians about nuclear issues. And that's yet a third crisis that has nothing to do with all the others. Well, there's only one problem. Everybody in the Middle East knows that all these issues are interconnected. And frankly, I think that some of the more intelligent people in Washington know it as well. They simply want us to believe that they're separate issues, because then we can proceed separately, and our actions in one place are not going to have consequences in another, supposedly. I'll just give you one example. If the United States pressured Israel to live up to a genuine two-state solution, where Palestinians and Israelis would both have viable states, living in peace, economically prosperous, which I think is possible to do, that would do more to undermine the Islamic State than all the bombs in the world. Because it would say to them, they would go out to their recruiters and say, you have to join us in the fight against U.S. imperialism and our support of the Palestinian people, which they do claim. And the recruits would say, well, wait a minute. They've made peace over here. They're living together in prosperity. Why should I be following you? It undercuts them politically, which is the key element of how to fight these folks, not simply militarily. And what would happen in the region if the U.S. actually succeeded in carrying out all these things? Well, it's possible that in the short run, the Islamic State would make some gains. But you know something? In the short run, they're already making gains. What would happen in the medium run is that the people of the region, already we see the fatal flaw in the Islamic State, which is that their rule is so harsh that they alienate the very people they claim to be representing, the Sunni Muslims. And the Sunnis already are rebelling against them in Syria. Some of the tribal groups have fought against them. They're brutally repressed, but you can't run a country or a region or a rebel group on repression alone. And as that becomes clear that that's what they're doing, it's going to engender uprisings and rebellions against them, and they're going to be, the solution that they find is going to be far better than if one that's imposed by the outside, on the outside by the United States. The other thing, just in conclusion, I've had a chance now to visit Syria 5 times. It's got a very vibrant culture of music and theater and even soap operas. They were famous throughout the Arab world for their soap operas. In Berkeley about a month ago, I helped put on a program called Jazz in Syria, where we brought together Arabic musicians, people who play Arabic percussion and oud, paired with jazz musicians, and they played Syrian songs in a jazz mode and jazz in that had been influenced by the Middle East, songs like Caravan and so on. It was a wonderful evening. I talked about the culture of Syria. So that's an example that even in exile, the Syrians are carrying on their vibrant culture, and it leads me to believe that I'm optimistic in the medium and the long run. Right now, most people think, well, gosh, every time we open up the paper, there's some new crisis, there's some new attack, the Islamic State seems to be making headway, and then the Ebola crisis hit, right? This is one disaster after another. But I'm actually optimistic because, for reasons stated, the weakness of the Islamic State, the vibrancy of the culture, and you got to keep a sense of humor about all of this. I'll leave you with just the observations of Jon Stewart. Yeah, that one that I watched 4 nights a week on Comedy Central. What he noted was that 65% of the American people support the bombing in Iraq, which is 15% more than can find Iraq on a map. Thank you all very much.
Questions. Before that, I want to announce that he has few books available here. will autograph them. And I also want to thank the World Affairs Council for making this evening possible. So, questions?
I was an English teacher 4 years in Middle Eastern countries. In 1994, I took a trip to Syria for a couple of weeks, and from Palmyra to Aleppo in the north. And it seemed like a reasonably well-run, enjoyable country where I had no problems traveling or talking to people and so on. And then this tendency we have to demonize. We demonize the Assad administration when they treat Christians well, when they have never done anything against us and had left Israel alone for a long time. But, do you think this propensity we have for demonization so that our military-industrial complex can get these huge contracts to so-called training, not really training is in Middle Eastern countries? Does that make sense?
Okay. Could everybody hear the question?
No.
Let's see if I can summarize it. He had traveled to Syria in the 90s. It seemed like a stable, happy place. Why did we demonize Assad, and is it because of the need of the military-industrial complex to make war, to repair suffering? Well, in my previous book, Conversations with Terrorists, I have an interview with Assad, and I note that he was a secular dictator. And it certainly wasn't the worst dictatorship in the region. Some of the US-backed ones like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, for example, are far worse in terms of their political repression. I think that's true. But nevertheless, it was a genuine revolt against him in 2011. It wasn't something sparked by outside powers as claimed by Assad. People were angry at the high unemployment. The drought had driven a lot of farmers off the land. The economy, Assad had adopted neoliberal policies, privatizing state industry and putting things in the hands of his cronies. So he had a crony capitalist system. And of course, politically, there was no chance to organize, say, a free trade union or student association. Everything had to be under the banner of the Ba'athist Party in Syria. So it was a bad dictatorship, and people rose up against them. As for the military-industrial complex, they certainly exist and have a strong lobby in Washington, but I don't think they make the determination. They're prepared for any war. I don't think they make the decision about particular wars. It's not like Lockheed calls up Obama and says, we're a little short this month, we might start a new war so we can replenish our missiles. It doesn't quite work that way. I think it has more to do with the strategic things that I described earlier. And out of that, of course, the military industrial complex folks make a lot